Hello, everyone. Let's face it, the past 2+ years have been pretty difficult for the travel and tourism industry. In fact, the industry flatlined for a short time, and then all this creativity came about. And the industry showed its resiliency in a way that I'm sure is going to be written about for decades to come. I was personally blown away today hearing the governor of Puerto Rico discussing the numbers for 2021. I mean, that lodging has gone up 12% from 2019. That's amazing. And what we're going to discuss in this panel is some of the formulas, some of the ideas that we can take this resiliency and perseverance that developed post-COVID-19 and bring it into the future. So first I'd like to introduce John Wasson of ICF, who's going to give us some ideas of a practical framework of how to bring forward the resiliency.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm John Wasson. I'm Chair and CEO of ICF. Before I begin my remarks, let me just say that what an impressive array of speakers and panelists and dancers today. Tough to follow. And having the former treasurer hand out $2 bills is particularly a tough act to follow. So I'm going to do my best with that. I was also pleased, Katie, to hear today that your parent company has been carbon neutral since 2006. We at ICF have also been carbon neutral since 2006, and it's the first time I've heard of another company being net neutral for that long. So that was really terrific to hear. So I'm here because I'm excited to launch a new report written in partnership with WTTC that will bring more resiliency and sustainability to the travel and tourism industry. Let me say I'm also grateful to be here this week on the island. We at ICF actually have a very sizable team right here in Puerto Rico working on the rebuilding and recovery efforts from Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And I have to say, I've always been amazed by the resilience of our Puerto Rican team, many of whom were directly impacted by the storms, through hurricanes, through COVID, through earthquakes, through power outage. These folks have shown up, passionate to help others and to deliver results. And so driven by positive impact, this team truly delivers on our company's purpose to build a more prosperous and resilient world for all. And so with that, as a shout out to that team, I do think we could all agree we're in a unique moment. It's a time of tremendous health, social, and environmental challenges, certainly going on right now, that are mandating that everyone think differently about sustainability and resilience. This is especially true in the travel and tourism industry, which has seen incredible and highly unique impacts, as you've heard this morning. And unfortunately, I think there's a real gap in the availability of industry resources to help on this front. Many published resources offer theories or academic ideas, but very few offer practical actions to take or practical frameworks on how to build long-term resilience plans. And that's exactly what this latest report that we're releasing today aims to do. Produced in partnership with WTTC, the report entitled Enhancing Resilience to Create Sustainability and Destination pulls from WTTC's and ICF's experience, as well as extensive interviews with the tourism destinations all over the world, from Las Vegas to Singapore, the Philippines, Kenya, the Bahamas, and many more. And so in the paper, we focus on 5 main areas where destinations should be building resilience: the natural environment, infrastructure, energy and water, the economy, and society. And from there, we deliver practical, actionable insights rooted in real-life stories on how to build resilience, inclusive of 12 case studies. So I certainly encourage you to read through the report in full, but let me share 4 key takeaways to consider when building sustainability and resilience. So first and foremost, as I think you've heard from a number of the panels today, we need to develop a strong governance model. Travel and tourism is a cross-cutting industry. It affects policy, society, and business, and more. And as such, there is a strong need to gain alignment across various sectors. So top-down leadership is essential. And when clarity and strategy can start at the top, and cascades through the ecosystem, real progress is possible. And so a good example of this is the Singapore case study in our report around the establishment of the Singapore Green Plan for 2030. This forward-thinking plan outlined cross-sector sustainability targets designed to advance a national agenda. It provides resources, incentives, and grants to help build resilience and sustainability and uses innovative solutions, which is exactly what was needed to ensure ongoing adoption. A second takeaway from our report is the importance of clear ownership, legitimacy, and transparency. So once you have a governance model, it's important that the leadership establish a framework of responsibility to ensure accountability and progress, to ensure the work gets done right, and in the best interest of the community. So that requires several things. Public-private partnerships, which we heard a number of panelists talk about today. It requires alignment on regulatory and policy matters and frameworks from governments, and it requires transparency. And so a good example in our report and a case study on this topic is right here in Puerto Rico. Following Hurricanes Irma and Maria, local officials established a recovery transparency portal. And that online website allowed everyone to review the rebuilding progress in real time. This created a high degree of trust and accountability between the citizens, the government, and other key stakeholders in the process. The third takeaway I'd share is the development of shared value projects. Shared value projects are action-oriented and jointly carried out by public and private organizations. They drive collaboration, community collaboration, while improving economic and social conditions and operational ecosystems. So Lanzarote, one of Spain's Canary Islands, is a great example of a destination project that created a shared value project. They're focused on the preservation of local cultural and heritage crafts, which are a major tourism draw. So that was a great example on that front. And finally, our report found there's a strong need to create a culture of learning on the resilience and sustainability fronts. And a great example of that in terms of learning from your creating the culture of continuous improvement is the state of California. And we just heard from the treasurer who resides in California. I think California has shown leadership around continuous learning on the sustainability and resilience front. I encourage you to read that case study in our report. And so with that, I'll stop there. I would, again, encourage everybody to have a look at the report. I think there's a lot of good information in it. We certainly look forward to discussing these topics as part of the panel here today, and we'd be pleased to take any questions during the lunch hour afterwards. So with that, I think we'll call the panel up.
So I'd like to introduce the rest of our panel, which is Jennifer Aquinaga, who is the Deputy Director for Policy and Planning at the U.S. Department of Commerce. We have Dan Richards, who's Chief Executive Officer of the Global Rescue Companies. And we have Jibran Shapoor, who's Executive Vice President of Palace Resorts. Now, we're going to start this session with a bit of an overarching question that we'll maybe come back to a few times. If anybody wants to comment immediately on the question, they can. Otherwise, I'll dive into some other questions that I have prepared. But our overarching question is, how can businesses and destinations enhance their resilience and drive sustainable and inclusive growth through their operations and investments? I suspect that the word investments is going to be the one that gets the audience attention there. So with that in mind, again, as the overarching question, I'd like to start with Jennifer, and not an easy question. And I'm wondering which 3 resilience priorities do we need to urgently address? And that is in terms of the sector's long-term competitiveness.
Thanks, Fran, and I'm not sure this is an easy question. The U.S. government over the past 6 months has really been focused on this question. We've been busy developing our new national travel and tourism strategy, and we're very excited that for the first time, this strategy includes, as one of 4 areas of focus, a chapter on fostering a resilient and sustainable travel and tourism sector. So our heads are really in this at the moment. So before I came here and kind of planning out what we wanted to talk about with my team, I posed this question to them, and I asked them what are the 3 resilience priorities, and each one of them gave me a different answer. So I think this really shows us that there are so many priorities that need to be addressed. So I'll just give you 3 here today for time purposes. So the first I would say is market supply. We need to ensure that there is sustainable, diverse, inclusive product in place that considers conservation needs of resources and biodiversity. Growing demand and growing tourism, as we are all trying to do in government and in our destinations, we know will only exacerbate sustainability challenges like overcrowding, livability, carrying capacity. So we really need to ensure that that diverse product is in place so that we can keep up with demand. Also, and this is still part of market supply, I think we need to ensure that there's economic and product diversification in place. So if we think that there are some communities that are very dependent on either a single source of tourism, like cruises, or a single season, think ski resorts in the winter, and not necessarily diversifying away from tourism, but more just not focused on that one single source. And so then the second priority I would say is mitigation, and in this area I'm talking about carbon specifically. I think we can all agree that time has run out and we need to lower carbon emissions. So establishing net zero and carbon reduction plans is a necessary first step, and also increasing innovation around sustainable fuels, electric vehicles, EV infrastructure, that sort of thing. That's something the strategy is also very focused on. And then finally, I would say disaster planning. Climate change impacts, they're here, they're upon us. So it's really, really critical that we incorporate that resiliency planning into tourism planning so that we're ready.
John, this is obviously a topic that you've looked at as well in terms of priorities. Do you have a follow-up comment too?
Well, I certainly agree with what Jennifer said. I mean, I do think that climate change needs to be a significant area of focus with respect to resilience. Obviously, several panelists said today that we're seeing more severe and more frequent storms. We're seeing more severe weather, and so I think that's a trend that's here to stay. And there needs to be planning around infrastructure and around planning in general on preparing and understanding the risks from climate change. Here in the Caribbean, it seems like every several years we have, a year or two, we have significant storms with significant damage and a cycle of kind of repair, storms, repair again. And I do think that we need to come up with long-term plans around climate change. I would also say that the whole economic resilience, I think with COVID, it's shown kind of what a shock in the system, certainly on the public health front, can do, and shut down travel and severely impact the travel and tourism industry. I do think that kind of having a risk analysis and doing planning when those kinds of shocks do, how can you pivot that industry to other markets or retrain people for other job opportunities is quite important. So the whole planning around the environmental, the public health, the infrastructure shocks is quite important.
Dan, I'll start with you with this question, but in follow-up, when we have a climate emergency, there's a reactive response. And then we have another climate emergency and there's another reactive response. So how can we effectively bring sustainable growth policies and processes into the mainstream so that it's not always that reactive response is more of a planned response?
Well, that's a great question and a challenging one. I think, at least from our perspective, we take a human-centric approach to try and solve these very difficult challenges, because at the end of the day, in the travel and tourism industry, we're selling something to somebody, and these people that are consuming the goods and services, they can't be afraid of consuming those services, otherwise they're not going to go and buy the product or travel to the destination. And so you have to create an envelope and a perception of safety and security. And by building that in sort of from the ground up, as a basic and foundational premise, that is how you secure the continued flow of travel and tourism and the dollars that come with it into these places, because we can't support investment in sustainability and resilience and all the other things without the traveler who is willing to come. So you have to have that sort of foundational premise prior to being able to address these other things, and that is that you're going to secure the environment and the location and the destination and the services and all the things that people are consuming for the traveler and for their benefit.
Gibran, should destinations be doing a better job at promoting their sustainable policies to attract the tourist? And how important is that promotion to retaining the tourists?
I truly believe that destinations would never agree on a single basis on what sustainability means. I think the companies, private companies, public companies should establish their sustainable basis. And to us in our company, in our family, the sustainability comes in two bases: the environmental and the people. I couldn't agree more with Mr. Frank Rainieri that tourism is people. When the pandemic came in March 2020, we have 14,000 staff members in the payroll. And the biggest decision we made was not to fire anyone, because in Mexico, by Mexican law, if you fire somebody, they won't have any social security anymore. And if it's a health problem that is there, they won't have access to hospitals. And the Mexican government didn't help at all. So when you come and see how resilient is a company, well, you just put in place what makes your company great. And what makes the company great is the people. We're not a brick and bed company, we're a people company. And when you put the staff in the center along with your clients, I think you become really resilient. Maybe the government of Mexico has another idea of what resilience means. Maybe my competition have another idea. But what we really think is that we have to put the people first, and then success will come later.
And this will go to the panel in general, so just wave at me, but what are some key operations and investments that you have witnessed in the travel and tourism sector that have had a positive contribution to sustainable and inclusive growth?
That question's for me?
Whoever. Go for it.
I just want to, about investment, and just to continue. In Dominican Republic, we're making a very big investment. It's a $600 million property. And we're investing $150 million more in building the city that Julia and Rosario were speaking about. We want to bring in the people along with their families, because it's not fair that somebody that would be making X amount of dollars to be waiters, to be housekeepers, won't see their children throughout the week. I have 3 children, and I wouldn't imagine to live and not seeing them maybe 3 times a month. So maybe the profitability will go lower, but when you put in place the people first, you would have better service. And with better service, you can charge higher rates. And with higher rates comes more profit. So it's a matter of vision, it's a matter of putting people first. And building a company without people is like building a house without foundations, because it won't simply sustain.
What are some of the key recommendations, I'll give you this one, Jennifer, that we can make to encourage more stakeholders to embark on the journey of sustainability?
Sure.
Following up on what Gibran said.
Thanks, Fran. I think first is awareness. For example, in the United States, President Biden's executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, this addresses climate change, but what does this mean at the destination and the firm level? I think we really underestimate the importance sometimes of awareness backed by data. And so that's why in our new strategy, we're really trying to better communicate data on the climate risks to travel and tourism communities in a way that is understandable and actionable and relevant to them at that level. And we are also trying to increase access to localized data about the climate impacts. We really think that's important. Also, I think a theme that we've heard already throughout the summit today is cooperation. It's really, really critical to work with travel and tourism leaders, like here with the World Travel and Tourism Council, and in the United States specifically, we have, our private sector travel and tourism advisory board, which Dan is actually a member of, which advises our Secretary of Commerce on travel and tourism priorities. And in that way, we can find ways that the government can support the private sector's work as they adapt to these changes, whether it's providing data, best practices, anything that they need, but cooperation. And then the final, I would say, is market adaptation. So helping suppliers see the market potential and customers to see the opportunities for sustainable options, and let them know the economic incentives for that. I think we heard about coral reefs earlier, but it's a really good example, because communities that have these coral reefs, they make billions of dollars from diving tours and hotels and recreational fishing trips, and that really gives them incentives to conserve the coral reefs.
So I'm hearing a lot about sharing, which I think is relevant to everybody in this room, and also about promotion of what you're doing to sort of gain the public trust. And is that a fair assessment? One thing that well-planned tourism development can raise awareness of is cultural and environmental values. What are some great examples that you have witnessed in terms of the sector encouraging or financing the protection of wildlife and the environment? And what do you see in the supply chain that others can learn from? I'll give you that question, Dan, if that's okay.
Well, I think that you bring up a very good question, and it was really very apparent during the pandemic just how important travel and tourism is to conservation, because when you have 60+ million people in our industry that are out of work, they turn, particularly in the developing world, to ways to sustain their families that are a lot less environmentally and conservation friendly than travel and tourism itself. So we actually saw in some of the the markets where we operate, people were turning to cutting down forests, creating charcoal, harvesting bushmeat, selling animals, those sorts of practices, because they no longer had a way to sustainably support their families, because they were in the travel and tourism industry, which had been so adversely affected by the pandemic. So I just want to add one more thing, and that is that I think it's incumbent on all of us to create to have the will to prevent what has just happened over the last 2 years from ever happening again. And we have the ability to prevent these shocks going forward. And of course, contagious disease like COVID has the ability to shut down our industry globally. But there are local and regional shocks, obviously, from storms that are created by climate change and a lot of other things that we need to prepare to as well. We simply need to make the decision as an industry that we're not going to allow this to happen again, and that will, to your prior point, require investment. And we are going to need to invest across the private sector and with our public sector partners to create an environment to prevent these sorts of things from happening. And we've got the technology to do it. I mean, you look at the aftermath of 9/11, for instance. We basically, certainly in the United States and globally, made a decision. We're not going to allow terrorists to use planes to kill people. And when you look at the last 21 years, we've been extraordinarily successful in preventing that from happening. We can do the same thing going forward with respect to breath-borne diseases and other kinds of illnesses. But that really is important to make those sorts of investments so that the people that are in these very fragile ecosystems can monetize travel and tourism and don't have to monetize by destroying the environments in which they live.
Siobhan, how about you? What are some of the things that you see the supply chain that has done that you really think are examples of what others can learn from?
Well, the supply chain is a big mess right now. No ships, or if you have a ship, it costs more than 4 times than it was in 2019, especially for investments in the islands. It's a big problem because obviously everything is by boat. And the interruption of the supply chain, what brings is a delay in the investments. Right now, we have a project that we wanted to finish by December this year. It would have to go by July next year, simply because the elevators are not there. And why? Because there is no ships. And why? Because all the problems in the commerce in the world. So it is a big issue. It's something that hopefully will be resolved in the next months, but who knows? We have to plan with more time. Any investment that would come has to be, you have to consider that, and especially for the Caribbean. We're in Puerto Rico, obviously everything is shipped here, and well, that's something to consider.
John, what are you seeing as the role of individual business leaders in fostering and influencing a more sustainable and inclusive environment?
Well, I mean, I think they have an absolutely critical role. I think as we've talked about, with the travel and tourism industry, I mean, it's a complex industry with multiple actors. We have industry, we have government, and we have broader society and other stakeholders. And so, I come back to you need to have all those stakeholders together, working together, typically in some kind of public-private partnership, to drive the sustainability goals together. And as part of that, as I think I mentioned in my opening remarks on our report, you need to have a clear governance model to help manage that. But at the end of the day, I think that partnership and that collaboration is absolutely critically important to drive sustainability, to drive resilience. And I think that's an absolute key feature of what needs to be done, in addition to the governance that kind of sits on top of that.
Well, let's follow up on that, Jennifer. What can governments do to foster and encourage resilience and sustainable growth?
Sure. So I think first we need to make it a priority and set goals. I mentioned the executive order, which really puts climate change at the front and center of U.S. foreign and domestic policy, which is really important. It really brings the whole of government together around reducing emissions in every sector, increasing resilience, that sort of thing. And then the fact that we were able to create our new national travel and tourism strategy, that really puts the focus specifically on travel and tourism. And then, I've said it before, but communication. The U.S. government specifically needs to do a better job of communicating the need for resilient and sustainable growth strategies, and that's what we're trying to do. We held a listening session on travel and tourism and climate a couple of months ago, and really what we heard from the sector was the need for concise, actionable data around climate. And it's really especially important to be able to communicate this data and this strategy, for mitigation and best practices to SMEs who may not have any idea how to embark on this journey. And then finally, again, another theme which I think we'll continue to hear over and over is cooperation, across all levels of government. John was just saying that's the only way we're going to get this thing done across, and with the private sector, of course.
So the U.S. is willing to cooperate with the Caribbean, for instance, and offer advice.
Absolutely.
I mean, is there a lot of that sharing going on?
Yeah, it's about communicating bilaterally, multilaterally across federal, local, state, tribal, and with the private sector. That's the only way this is going to happen.
So cooperation, everyone, right? towards the common end goal. How can the travel and tourism sector better prepare for and mitigate the effect of disasters and crises? As a follow-up to that, how can it be part of the reconstruction process to support a destination's recovery, and along with that, obviously, the COVID recovery and unfortunately, probably future pandemic recoveries? Mm-hmm. Who wants to tackle that? Go ahead, Dan.
Happy to do it. Not to say the word over and over again, but investment here is key, right? So you have to invest in a plan, so having emergency action plans in place to deal with these hazards and to prevent these shocks. You have to stockpile the resources that you're going to need, whether it's a storm or a future pandemic or other kinds of natural disasters. You've got to put that in place. You need to train your personnel, right? I'm obviously in the crisis business, but guys like Gibran, he's busy running a hotel company in a destination, and most of his personnel are not thinking about crisis and catastrophe every day, but they all have a role to play when the crisis occurs. So you need all of those things to come together, and then ultimately, at the end of the day, we do need to partner with and collaborate with government, because there are no entities that have resources like governments, and we need to be coordinated so that we have people all sort of marching in the same direction and who are coordinated and can be effective when these things happen.
Well, let's talk from your perspective, Gibran. So I'm a hotel in the Caribbean, if you want, in the Dominican Republic. I'm a new hotel, and I need to come up with a plan because I know hurricanes happen, and I know other things happen. So how do I get started? How do I make sure that I have a plan that's going to be putting me in that realm of resiliency that I feel confident about, even though I don't know what the disaster that may or may not come is going to be?
Well, first, you have to have a safe place to be at. You have to invest truly in certified places for hurricanes. Just to give an example, in Moon Palace in Cancun, we have over 10,000 guests every day. And when you have a hurricane, obviously the first thing to do is to fly the most amount of people home, but they cannot leave in 1 or 2 days. But whoever stays there, we have a safe place for 4,000 guests, but also you need the personnel to run that 4,000 people in a ballroom where you could imagine you have to be entertaining the children, you have to be giving them food, water. They're on vacations, even if they're in a hurricane. And we had that experience 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I don't recall very well, where we had 2 hurricanes in 1 month. And that happened twice, so our staff is already ready for that. But just as a closing comment, to be resilient, you have to be sustainable. And to be sustainable, there's 2 core foundations for that: environment and people. When you take care of the environment, and here, at least in our company, we're going carbon neutral in 2025. It's extremely hard because of the amount of waste hotels generate. But as we say in Spanish, el que reza y peca empata. So you have to make actions
But,
to
counter.
counter.
We have to do what we need to do.
All the waste that you generate, all the electricity that you burn, and also in terms of human being, as I mentioned already, you have to put people first, the staff first, and then that's the way you really become resilient and sustainable.
So let's get back to that overarching question we started with as a follow-up to that. And it, again, is how can businesses and destination enhance their resilience and drive sustainable and inclusive growth through their operations and investments? John, maybe I'll throw that one down to you.
Well, sure. I mean, again, I think it comes down to kind of, we need both sides, private sector, governments involved kind of at the local, the regional, the national level, in resilience and sustainability efforts working in partnership. The other thing I would say to what Dan said is, it is also important that the private sector is aware of what the government and the resources the government can bring on the mitigation and resilience side. I will tell you, here in Puerto Rico, we've been involved in the rebuilding here, and there's significant resources coming from the federal government through the Federal Emergency Management Agency to support the repair and rebuilding of infrastructure here in Puerto Rico, from schools to housing to port authorities to roads and bridges. There's significant money flowing under the Community Development Block Grant Program to help homeowners rebuild their homes damaged in the storms. And then in the last several years, the U.S. government has created a new bucket of funding on mitigation, which is all about providing funding to harden resources and so minimize the damage when the storms occur. And that's an area where the private sector and the government should be sitting down side by side with an understanding how to best deploy those resources, to improve resiliency and improve sustainability. And I think that is occurring in Puerto Rico, but I think it's an important step.
Jennifer, you might have a comment on that as well, I suspect. But how do we sort of dive into improving that government, making sure that everybody knows what's available? Are there sort of practical ways to make that happen?
I think it comes down to communication and really taking a whole of government approach to everything. And that's what we, are trying to do. We're really trying to enforce that from this new strategy that, tourism development should be done holistically with sustainability and community-based strategies in mind from the beginning, and really as we are working to grow tourism, which we are working to grow tourism, we really need to think about in a way that we keep those challenges in mind at the same time. And so, I really think that if we work together, we can create a destination management model that really keep sustainability in mind. And, just by pulling the government together within this new strategy, which is, I know I keep harping on the strategy, but, we're really proud of it. And, it's the first one in 10 years. And, this really serves to unite the government around this issue. And in that way, we can work to communicate it and work more with the private sector.
So the encouraging thing being that your government is listening to you, your government is there, and the government's ready to make investments.
Exactly.
Which I hope is the case in other places around the world in addition to the United States. Gibran, do you feel like you get enough support from the government sector in terms of sustainability resilience?
Not at all. Not in Mexico. No. In Dominican Republic completely. Also in Jamaica, but in Mexico, unfortunately, we're not.
So how do you improve that as a
Well, we
business?
just do it ourselves. We don't need the government to do it. Because if we're always waiting for the government to do things for us, we're never going to get anywhere.
And what is your opinion, Dan, on the subject?
Well, if you have a need and that need is to prevent existential threats from destroying your business, somebody like Gibran has no choice but to figure out how to meet those needs. So it's obviously helpful if you can coordinate with government because, no private sector entity has the resources of government. But in lieu of that, you've got to figure out how to do it yourself. And those resources are out there and are available. Unfortunately, none of us are big enough, and even individual governments are not big enough to prevent some of the massive systemic threats that we're confronting. And we do need government, and we do need to be aligned, and they do need to be on board, and we need to be on board with them, and they need to listen, and we need to listen. So, my hope is that going forward, we identify what these systemic threats are, and we work collaboratively to defeat them. And I think that we have the ability, we certainly have the technology to do it. We just have to have the will to do it.
All right, so closing thoughts because we've got a hungry crowd here, I suspect, but closing thoughts on this issue of resiliency and how we move forward.
I would echo what some of the prior speakers and panelists said. I do think that, we can have both resiliency and a prosperous economy. You can have both. And so it's a matter of putting the policies in place to do that, and kind of finding the partnership between the private sector and the public sector to help drive that. But I do think, that has to be the long-term goal, both resilience and prosperity.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I think we all know that travel and tourism is an incredibly resilient sector, but, after coming out of the pandemic, I think that we now know that the more we can build resiliency into tourism planning, the better we will be and the sooner that we will recover in the future. So just by what we've been talking about, cooperation, collaboration, communication, that this is how we can do that.
And lessons learned every time we deal with this kind of situation. Siobhan?
The government should set the base on how a sustainable destination should be taken care of, and the private companies or the companies should follow with example. You're never too large or you're never too small to start doing it. People think that only the big companies can do so. Not at all. Any company, whatever the size of the company, they can do it. And to be resilient means the resiliency and the profitability are not fight once against each other.
Dan?
As I said before, I think that only government and the private sector working together can tackle these systemic sorts of risks. That said, government needs to listen to operators like Gibran, because Gibran is going to know what his needs are better than anybody else, better than consultants, better than government, better than anyone. So collecting what those needs are from the private sector and then providing support and enablement to help the private sector meet those needs. Private sector is going to thrive if government helps, as opposed to, coming up with frameworks that aren't necessarily dependent on what the private sector has to say. So it really needs to be a collaborative effort going forward.
So a lot about cooperation today. Well, thank you. I want to thank the panelists, and we'll see you all after lunch.